Michael, welcome to the show.
Thanks for having me.
Yeah, it's a pleasure to have you here. I've been following you for quite a while, but what really attracted me to you most recently was seeing that you worked for KPMG and then left your job to pursue something more fulfilling. And I could really identify with that after working in consulting for a number of years myself. So, can you describe the moment you knew you had to quit your job?
Oh God, there's a couple of them. So I guess one moment that really made it clear to me was in a job before KPMG actually was when my manager told me that I was not overperforming enough. And that kind of exactly the facial expression you're making now is kind of how I went inside. You're not overperforming enough. And I somehow like saw through something at that point of like, oh no, I can't keep playing this game. I'm
Mm,
not someone who's able to overperform and then be told that's not enough for whatever purpose it may have been that it was motivating. It wasn't motivating. But in terms of KPMG, there was a moment when the partner in my team phoned up and said, Michael, clear your evenings. We've got a very important client thing due this weekend, whatever. And I happened to have plans. And I said, no, I have evening plans. I have things I'm doing. And he tried various different ways to get me to cancel my plans. And I just thought, you know what, this is, I can't keep doing this for another 30 years in this way. I need to find something else to do. I'm no longer prepared to go along with this kind of thing.
I find it remarkable that I worked for a different consulting company. You worked for KPMG. You're in the UK, I'm in the United States, but the experiences we've had are so similar. And like you work in a totally different practice than I worked in. It's not even the same type of area, but it seems to me that consulting is just the same everywhere. I've had this same experience of like, yeah, it's 7 p.m. We're going to need you guys to stay another 3 or 4 hours so we can get this done. Or it's Friday afternoon. Hey, I'm going to need you to work this weekend. And
Mm.
when you say like, I've got stuff going on this weekend, I've gotten lectures from directors about, this is the type of thing we do to provide for our family. And like, they really try to guilt you into feeling like you have to be there.
Yeah. It was the guilt thing that got me as well. It's like I heard things like, well, if you don't do it, someone else in the team has to do it, and you don't want that, do you?
Mm,
I'm like, well, that's true that they'll have to do it, but they can also say no, and that's not on me to police their boundaries. But this kind of thing is rife, It's just part of the culture where I guess in the sense they're right. This is not a 9 to 7 job. This is the
mm.
kind of job when you have to be available if you want to be, if they need you to be. But I just wasn't prepared to live that lifestyle, I guess. I wasn't someone who could go along with that.
Yeah, I felt for a long time that, this is a salaried position and you're
Mm.
paid in such a way that you have to be available and you have to put up with the stress. But then at a certain point, I just kind of said like, I don't really care to have the money anymore if it
Mm.
comes along with this other stuff. And I really didn't even have it that bad. You probably had it worse than I did, but yeah, it's frustrating and that's not how work should be. Do you think that because you were in London and I was in New York, it was any different? Like, do you think if we had been in different cities, the experience would have been different?
I don't know about different cities, but certainly I think the European versus US culture is different. So I think we have more protections and generally more, from what I can tell anyway. Like, I had 25 days of annual leave when I started, and I believe in the US that's much, much smaller. So perhaps from that perspective, but in terms of the expectations, I think that's more a consulting thing than it is a locational thing.
Yeah, you're probably right. So I've heard you talk before about conversations with coworkers where they were kind of complaining about the job, but they had this mindset of, well, this is just how life is. I don't have to like my job. I just do it. This is just my life. And I've had this same experience too when I worked in consulting. And I think what differentiates a person like that from a person like you, well, let me back up. What do you think differentiates a person like that from a person like you?
Oh, there's a couple of things. So one thing that stands out for me is I had a burnout experience a couple of jobs ago where I had been working, and this wasn't in consulting, but before that, I had been working 70, 80-hour weeks for a few months and I hadn't been taking breaks. I hadn't been looking after myself. And then one morning I woke up and I couldn't work anymore, put it that way. So having been through an experience like that, it's much easier to see the damage that can be caused, I think, of like, oh, if I carry on this way, I'll end up in that kind of place again. And then seeing that kind of behavior in other people from the perspective of having gone through it is a very illuminating one. It's like,
Mm,
oh, I said those things, I had that perspective, I didn't think it would happen to me, and then it did. But then the thing is, you can't really you can't say that so bluntly. You can't say, hey, co-worker, do you know what you're doing to yourself here? It's kind of patronizing, or you seem naive or something. But there are ways of kind of nudging and hinting and kind of, I think, being a force for good in these environments. But it was a journey that I had to go on personally, I think, to kind of recognize what I was doing to myself.
Do you know any people who kind of made this mental transition from like, yeah, I'm just going to work myself to the bone to, hey, I'm going to go do something that I like without having the burnout experience that you had?
None personally, I think. In fact, most of my friends, I think, are working harder than before, but they haven't had the burnout experience. I would mainly look to Twitter for that kind of thing, honestly, because for some reason, Twitter is where the weirdos go. And if there are any stories about leaving work without having gone through the pain first, I think that's where they'll be found. That said, though, even on Twitter, most of the stories seem to have like, I had my moment of realizing I couldn't keep doing this. I missed my family, or I didn't see this, or I had health issues, or whatever. And then I was awakened to this fact. But there are precious few stories, I think, of people who just naturally come to this realization without some kind of prod from life.
Yeah. So you mentioned Twitter, and this Twitter neighborhood that you and I kind of reside in, they talk a lot about being an entrepreneur, and they almost discount the value of working for a big company. So I recently left like quote unquote corporate America to go work for a startup. So I appreciate the thought process, but there are certainly benefits to working for a big company. What do you miss about working for KPMG or any other big corporation?
So it's been about 3 months now, and I would say I miss having exposure to a team
Mm,
members, that camaraderie that comes up from having shared work experience on something. As much as I would dislike the last minute scramble to make slides for a client or whatever, there is a sense of fun attached to it. There's, oh, can we just push through? Can we just do this? And there's something really actually quite meaningful in that short-term experience, if not the
mm,
long-term one. So I miss that to some extent. And I'm replacing that with Twitter as well, honestly. I miss the opportunity to work on things that I wouldn't otherwise have chosen, honestly. So like, you are now going to learn about this topic. I'm like, okay, it's something that I now have to self-direct myself towards, which is
mm.
better for me as an individual. It's just more like how I work. But I worry, I guess, that I'm missing out on things that I just wouldn't naturally go to myself. So just consulting is short paced, learn this, do a good job, then move on. There's something about that I quite like as well.
Mm.
And linked to that, I guess there's skills as well. So I had opportunities to do things like speaker conferences, for example, that I never would have got as an individual. So there's something about the organization taking you in its direction and you having to upskill on the way that I think I will look back on and think, okay, I really value having gone through that 10 years worth of corporate consulting experience to get those skills.
Yeah, yeah. How are you replacing the camaraderie with Twitter?
So I have loads of Zoom calls with people. So intro calls. I think what I found during COVID, so working from home started not long after I joined KPMG. It was about 4 or 5 months in, maybe 6. And I didn't have a close enough bond with my colleagues to kind of just hang out with them on Teams calls and that kind of thing.
Yeah.
But Twitter was there as a kind of, that became my new water cooler. I was like, okay, I feel a bit like alone. I was living alone at the time. I can just go on Twitter and like just hang out a little bit and get that kind of social interaction. So now there's a bunch of shared DM groups, there's Zooms, there's the entire cohort of people going through online courses, and they show up in different online courses. You kind of see each other, and I think once you know that you can reach out to people and say, hey, let's have a conversation, or even, hey, let's be friends at some point, that's the thing you can do. I think I'd feel much more alone in this life if I didn't have access to that kind of on-demand community that I have now on Twitter.
Yeah, I don't think I do as much of that as you do, but I probably do more of it than the average person.
Right.
Is there like a specific personality type or skill set or something that you need to practice to feel comfortable doing this? Because like my fiance is a pretty social person. She's got a bunch of friends. She gets along well with people, but she thinks it's totally weird that I meet strangers on the
Right.
internet and develop these friendships, So like, where's the disconnect there?
I think it comes down to experience and realizing that it's not like, it's weird from the outside, but once you've tried it a bit, it becomes very normal.
Mm,
And I wondered why I was okay at Twitter until I realized that I was doing the whole forum thing in the mid 2000s. So I was making friends on random internet forums long before I was on Twitter. I
mm,
even met, I think, a girlfriend on Twitter. Sorry, not on Twitter, sorry, the forum before. And something about doing it a lot and kind of realizing that these are still humans, just like the ones you'd meet at work or at university or whatever. It's just that the frames are different. You can kind of learn to play with the frame, and the friend making process becomes a little bit more explicit. Like you can you're not just thrown together in a workplace or a university setting where it just emerges. You have to be a little bit more intentional with it. But once I think you're on that flywheel, you realize that, oh, this is just fine. It's just that my old perspective thought it was weird. You have to overcome that perspective shift, I think.
Yeah, yeah. So I think what's cool about meeting people online, and specifically on Twitter, is that you are connecting over a very specific shared interest. You're there for the exact same reason. Whereas like making friends at work or at college or whatever, you're there generally, broadly for the same reason, but you're probably not going to have the same interest overlaps as you would have with somebody that you met on Twitter, because you're like following the same people and you have the same interests. And it's cool how the internet has broken down these geographic barriers of who we can be friends with and who we can collaborate with. I like that idea a lot.
I totally agree. And there's connecting over specific interest areas and subjects, but on Twitter as well, it's just I'm going to call it the vibe. Like once you know just how to hang out and not talk about anything in particular, but you have certain ways of talking about nothing in particular, you can get quite deep from that. So I've now had Zoom calls, people I've been, in the replies with on Twitter for a few months, and we either meet in person now because the restrictions are lifting, or we have a Zoom call, and we can just go straight into as if we were old friends, because we've had a very large number of low pressure interactions over a long time. I mean, that's kind of how friendship happens, right? In the workplace, you're with people, random conversations about whatever, long term, kind of have familiarity. And then at some point you have to take a step from that to friendship. You have to okay, well, we're going to very quietly leave behind colleague land and enter this place. This is now maybe friendship or something else. But someone has to go first. And it's easier, I find, in the low pressure environment of Twitter, because you're not already in the workplace mode. You're not moving from colleague to friend. You're moving from random internet stranger to friend.
Right.
So I find that easier.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. It's a really cool process. So you quit your job primarily to teach the Alexander technique. Most people, myself included, don't really understand what that is. Can you give a high level explanation?
Sure. So the way that I'm describing it at the moment is it's a way of getting out of your own way. So all the ways that you interfere with your own functioning, whether emotional, psychological, physical, it's a way of noticing all of that stuff and deciding not to do it and making new choices instead. An example I would give is say playing baseball, you hit a home run, it's great. And then you choke because you have to do that thing again. You're like, okay, what did I do just now to hit the ball so well? Well, I was standing like this, I was breathing like this, and all of a sudden you're doing all the things you weren't doing when you hit the ball so well. And Alexander technique is a way of unchoking yourself in that way, so to speak. Just stop interfering.
Interesting. So this brings to mind something that David Perel talks about, which is, let me make sure I get this right here. It's practice analytically, perform intuitively, right? So the Alexander technique kind of feels like the perform intuitively piece of that equation.
Yeah, partly. It's allowing the part of you that does perform intuitively to do its thing, but while still, and this is a bit more technical now, while still staying conscious the entire time. So let's say you're in a flow state, which I think is something else. You might lose track of time. You might kind of just get absorbed in the thing in a flow state. Alexander technique keeps you fully conscious the entire time, such that you could choose to do anything else the entire time if you wanted to. You're not just caught up in the moment. So you're very much alive and able to make choices.
Interesting. What would you say is the biggest benefit in your life of practicing the Alexander technique?
Great question. There's a few, actually. One kind of meta benefit, I think, is just learning that I can say no. And so in the Alexander technique frame, that means I can say no to conditioned responses. I can say no to automatic behaviors. And that's translated into, say, work environments where someone's abusing a boundary, shall we say, let's say it's a manager. Learning that I can say no to that and assert a boundary without getting angry, without getting overly emotional, and just saying no is weirdly difficult to deal with, I think, if you're the manager, if you're the abusive manager in that situation. So that's a kind of a high level example, but more specifically, even things like public speaking. So in the moment before I go up in a conference and give a talk, I can notice all of my anxieties and all the thought loops trying to drag me down, and I can kind of step out of all of them and connect with the audience and just be there and allow the anxiety to just do its thing without being dominated by it, if you like. So it just applies all over the place, but that's an example that comes to mind now.
Wow, that's really cool. I'm interested in what you said about saying no to a manager. So like very specifically, what does that look like? Is that like a request from them and you just simply unemotionally saying no? Or is it no with some elaboration? Or like how does that work?
Well, so if let's say a manager asks you to work an evening, right? You can. There's a couple of different ways you can respond to that. Either you can say yes when you mean no. Everything inside you is saying no, but you say yes. That's kind of, you're not going to be a good worker. You're not going to enjoy your time there, and the manager won't get good output from you. There'll be a kind of resistance in there. There's saying no, which is a kind of emotional, or I'm going to say almost a childlike kind of no, I don't want to, like a kind of an emotional no. Or a passive aggressive no, or kind of these other things with it. There's a justifying no, which is no because blah, 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 blah. I have all these reasons why I can't do this thing. Or you can just say no, no justification, no because, no apologies even. Like, no, I can't do that today. Well, why not? Well, what's that to do with you? I said, no, I can't do it. You know, why do you need to know why I can't do it? Why do I need to apologize for this? I just can't do it. It's a very different way of being that doesn't allow me to get disturbed while saying no. It doesn't require me to compromise myself while saying no.
What type of reactions would you typically get from a manager when you said no like that?
Absolute bafflement, honestly. They have no idea how to deal with it. So if you say no without giving a reason, it's quite common to be asked what your reasons are, and you cannot play that game. You can see there's a game being played. If you start justifying yourself, then you're playing that game. You're getting involved in that thing. Whereas if you don't give space for that by saying, I can't do it, then it leaves very few lines of attack for the other person. It means that you have to know what you're doing. If I'm saying no, it means, okay, not only am I choosing very confidently to say no in this moment, but it might also compromise my prospects, my relationship here. Like there are consequences from saying no. It's not like there's nothing going to happen. I recognized early on at KPMG that if I kept saying no and protecting my evenings and not taking on too much work and that kind of thing, that I probably wouldn't get promoted, or not at the right schedule that everyone else did, or whatever else. And I had to be okay with that. And I was, because I didn't think I'd be there long term once I'd been there for a couple of months. So yeah, there's a lot to think about, but I liked having the capacity to be able to say no if I wanted to, because fundamentally I believe that you can't say yes if you don't know that you can say no first, right? If I say yes to you without knowing I can say no, it's not really a yes, I think.
Right. Oh, wow. What level were you at KPMG?
I was a manager. So the hierarchy was essentially analyst, associate, or assistant manager, then manager, associate director, director. So I was in the middle of those three, of those five. So.
Okay. What prompted you to learn the Alexander technique?
So my history with it comes from having exceptionally bad knees, which have dislocated and done all kinds of bad things over my life since I was about 11. And Alexander technique is most often associated with posture, with body mechanics, and all that kind of thing. Actors use it, sports people use it. And I had a period of my 20s when I was quite anxious about my knees and degradation and long-term damage. And for some reason, Alexander technique came back into my head as, oh, there's this thing that I could look into. I don't know, maybe. And by absolute fluke, there was a school of Alexander technique next to my office at the time, which I went along to. And within like 1 or 2 lessons, I suddenly realized that this was very much something else. But I had such a strong experience with it that I just thought I have to dig into this thing very deeply. And again, the second stroke of luck there was that school was one of the only ones in the world that offered part-time teacher training. Normally, you have to quit your job and do a 3 years, 4-day-a-week type deal, and you can do nothing else around it because you haven't got time really, or part-time jobs, which I would never have done in my life. So the fact that there was this very usefully structured teacher training course next to my office at the time was just a couple of like serendipities that I couldn't believe at the time, honestly.
So how long was your training process?
It was 3 years in the end. So 2014 to 2017, a couple of evenings a week, weekend, month, that kind of thing, and week-long retreats here and there.
So it's pretty involved. It's not like you just take some online certification course or something.
Oh, no. So traditionally, under most certification schemes, it takes 1,600 hours to become a teacher. My professional body there's no time requirement, but you have to be sponsored by 3 senior teaching members. So they have to say, like, you definitely know what you're talking about. And whenever you're ready for that, we'll let you in. It took me, I think, somewhere over 1,000 hours of training to qualify.
Okay. Is there a specific type of person that benefits most from Alexander Technique?
So in my experience, people who are very thinky, very intellectual, are in their heads, put it that way, benefit quite a lot from this, because it helps you to notice all of your thinking patterns and step out of them. So I call this expanded awareness. So where you are available to be in the world while still able to think clearly, rather than, my example is kind of being stuck in your phone or stuck in your own thoughts, or in some way collapsed in yourself, in your mind or in your body, rather than being connected to the wider space. That will sound a bit woo-woo. It does make sense. I'm happy to kind of dig into it more if you want. But people who I would characterize in their heads would benefit a lot, I think, from this. And most of my students actually seem to be computer scientists, coders, randomly. I think I've just kind of found a way of talking to them, perhaps.
Interesting. So I think what might help listeners kind of conceptualize this is if you could give an example of maybe an exercise that you teach your students to do.
So what I guide my students into during the online course I've made is to become aware of the wider space around them and notice what capacities that gives you. So I'll walk through something quickly. So for those listening, for you as well, just check right now, if there were an aircraft going overhead, just check that you could notice that sound from it. You need to go and look for it. You don't need to kind of go and check if it's there or not. But if there were sense information, and you can probably hear a sound in my background, which is quite good. If there were a sound, just check that you could notice it. And what this gives you is availability in that direction. So you're now able to respond to something in that direction because you're able to notice it. And I call awareness something is being able to notice things that could be noticed. So by contrast, if you're stuck scrolling Twitter and someone calls your name, you might hear it, but you wouldn't notice it, right? So expanding your awareness gives you capacity to notice things. Now, from there, I would suggest to people some kind of stimulus, a trigger, which in the course is, in a minute, I'm going to ask you to identify an object that you can pick up. Now, for most people, as soon as I say that, their awareness immediately collapses and they're already looking for things to pick up. Like, I don't know if that happened to you, but like, oh, what can I pick up? Even though I said in a minute, I hadn't even said to do it now, your mind goes off. And at that time, your awareness collapses as well. So you can notice this expansion and collapse of awareness, reassert the expansion, and then move in the world like this. It just gives you more choice, more freedom, more ways of being in the world, put it that way.
Yeah, this makes a lot of sense. And for me, it brings to mind a meditation practice. How does it differ from, how does Alexander Technique differ from meditation?
So there are lots of kinds of meditation, so I'll avoid generalizing too much, but Alexander Technique is very much done in part of day-to-day life. So if you go and see a teacher, you will normally either come with a day-to-day activity, or they'll suggest something like sitting down, standing up, picking up some object, whatever it might be. There's no formal practice of sitting down and doing Alexander Technique. It's something that you integrate into your entire life. Now, in meditation, it seems like the main focus is around concentration. So pick an object in your attention and keep your attention there. And if attention drifts off, then come back, right? Now, attention is something that moves around within the wider field of awareness, right? So like, as I was saying earlier, awareness is what you can notice. Attention is the capacity to look at something in your awareness.
Okay.
So Alexander Technique deals much more with awareness and attention. So while you're in activity, can you play with your awareness rather than focus your attention? If that makes sense.
It does. Yeah. It seems more practically applicable than meditation, maybe.
I think so. I think they both have their uses, and I would like to get more deeply involved in, say, concentration meditation so I can get better at focusing. But something I would suggest to my students is, okay, you've now learned about awareness. Go for a walk without headphones in, no podcast, no music, whatever. Just if you can find a wood, that would be great. And just expand your awareness as much as you can while walking. And notice what changes. Like, notice how your walking changes. Notice how your thoughts change. Notice when your awareness might collapse and what caused it to collapse. And then reassert the expansion and all that kind of thing. And what tends to happen is that people discover things on their own. So I can't teach people how to walk differently, but they might discover that walking happens differently as an indirect result of what I'm teaching them to do.
So you've got this course out there now. How is that structured?
So I started off teaching Alumni technique on Twitter, basically, because I just thought it'd be fun. I'll just say up front that if I planned to make an online course, I would never have chosen Alexander technique because it's probably the most, I wouldn't say difficult, but the entire profession just doesn't go there. They probably believe it's not possible. But the way it happened was I was largely shitposting on Twitter on like, hey, try this exercise, do this. How about this idea? And people kind of liked it. And eventually I thought, okay, let me do a few intro Zoom calls. So I set up, I think, 25, 30 odd calls. People could donate if they wanted to. It was like a half hour, 45-minute intro to the ideas, and we could kind of dig into it. After about 20 calls like this, I kind of, well, first of all, got a bit bored because it was just the same call over and over again. And then I realized that the format of the call was converging onto a very common format. If I say these things in this order, in this way, most people get an experience that they find useful. So I just realized, oh, I can just record myself saying this stuff and people can pay for that. And I can then move up the level of abstraction, if you like, so I can kind of think about more detailed things. But when I had that idea, I thought, okay, well, there's a lot more that I can add to this around the call structure. So the whole course now is based around that same process in the call, but there's a lot more content to kind of help people when they get stuck or add more detail, more examples, more exercises, that kind of thing. But it very much stemmed from just doing a bunch of what you might call customer interviews almost.
So it's basically video modules with exercises?
Yeah, it's almost entirely video. And I encourage people not to take notes. There's no worksheets, but I show them an effect of their awareness, if you like, and then say, go off and play with this in your life and see what happens. And there's enough content there and enough avenues for exploration that people tend to find some way of playing with it in their own life. And I have enough, I think, enough of an end-to-end framework that they're not completely lost. So they can always conceptualize what they're doing in the wider context. But the vast majority is just listen to me and see what happens and then go off and play with it.
So for people who work their way through your course and they're like, wow, this is really awesome, I'd like to go deeper, do you offer individualized coaching beyond the course?
So it's something I'm thinking about. I don't currently offer more in-depth AT lessons because I'm not sure how, honestly. And I think I'd rather focus on the course, but I do one-on-one coaching with people that is heavily inspired by Alexander technique, but I don't frame it as Alexander technique. So again, it's largely helping people get out of their own way. So very normally successful people who are used to forcing themselves and pushing hard and crushing it, I help them to kind of undo that process so that they can be playful and have fun while they're doing what they're doing, rather than pushing really hard.
Yeah. I think there's a big demand for that.
Yeah, it's interesting to see the same kind of things come up. I mean, most people have a voice in their heads that yells at them, and they respond to that voice in their head by crunching down their bodies, and it's an unpleasant cycle where you don't do something, so you yell at yourself, so you don't do something because you're yelling at yourself, or you do it, but it's not a very easy way of doing it. And just ease off that entire system. If you stop pressuring yourself, the stuff still gets done. It's much easier to do it because you're not forcing. It's very weird to see it, but it is now working quite consistently, which is amazing to see.
Wow, that's got to be really rewarding for you, right?
Honestly, it's wonderful. I had a really interesting moments where people send me messages on the forum, or I see clients like grow, and I get feedback that is kind of like, oh, you've really helped me change. I'm finding this playful now. I didn't realize this was possible. And I contrast that kind of feedback to a consulting environment where you just don't get any kind of constructive, like you get constructive feedback, I should say, but you don't get particularly soul warming feedback, put it that way. Even if the client says you did a great job, it's not quite the same. It doesn't reach the same parts of your being as getting heartfelt feedback from, say, one of my students or a coaching client.
Right. Oh man, that's so cool. I'm really glad you've been able to make that switch from soulless consulting work to something that's a little bit more fulfilling. That's really cool.
I should jump in a little bit there as well. My work was never, I think, completely soulless. I was always working on topics that I found meaningful. So I worked in low carbon energy innovation, energy system transformation, that kind of thing. And I liked that. I just didn't always get on well with the frames in which that was being done. At some point, I wouldn't mind going back into that stuff, and I can even see doing it in a consulting context. But the culture of that consultancy that I would want to, help influence myself would be very different. That's all.
Yeah, that's fair. That's fair. So I know you've had some pretty good initial success with sales of your course, and correct me if I'm wrong, but I think that was on the back of your email list. Is that right?
Yeah, that's right.
So how many email subscribers do you have right now?
Right now, I have 1,150, I think.
Okay. And how long have you been building that list?
So that list started, I think, in April 2020. So about a year.
Oh, okay. Wow. So that's pretty good growth over a year. What
Yeah,
what would
I have no context, but I think it's pretty decent. Yeah.
yeah. What would you say has been the most useful tactic for growing?
So on Twitter, I think my threads have really helped. So I
Mm,
have a pinned thread of threads on my Twitter profile that it just lives there now, and there's something like 40 threads in there. And what I find people doing is they kind of stumble upon my world a little bit on Twitter. So they'll find a thread somewhere or a tweet out of context. What I've done to help kind of navigate the knowledge graph, if you like, is at the end of each thread, I've said, here's a tweet link back to the thread of threads. So if you found this thread in isolation, here's a link back to the big one. And people just kind of wander around, and eventually they'll find the newsletter. And my stuff is pretty plain English. There are no screenshots of text. It's all kind of try this experiment as you read type stuff. And
okay.
many people find that they have some kind of experience while they read, and that invites them to kind of dig a bit deeper. And I think one thing I'm lucky with Twitter as well is that because there's such a wide surface area of people to find it, like I cast a very wide net, if you like, without realizing it. So it might be that, let's say, 100,000 people have seen that tweet thread or tweets in that thread, mega thread. Maybe 10,000 have actually clicked through, and maybe 100 of those or 1,000 of those became on the newsletter. But I don't know who to target necessarily. People kind of self-select into the newsletter. So by casting a really wide net, the ones who resonate with it are the ones who eventually land on the newsletter and buy the course. But I'm not going out there targeting this group or that group. Yeah, at some point I will have to, but for now it's just been very organic.
Yeah. What approximate conversion rate did you see from your list?
So I have 300 students, so 300 over 1,100.
Wow.
25%.
So you would say most of your students, if not all, came from your email list?
Exclusively. I've never sold to Twitter. Yeah.
Oh,
There are
wow.
a few who I've kind of asked to be in one-on-one, or I've given access to. So let's say it's 250. All of those came via the newsletter list. Yeah, exactly.
Okay. Wow, that's great. That's really good.
Thank you.
I'd like to touch on Rite of Passage a little bit because,
Sure.
we're both alums. I think it's been really beneficial for both of us. So briefly for listeners, Rite of Passage is David Perel's online writing course where he kind of walks you through how to write online, everything from information collection to setting up your website to how to collect emails to what you should be putting out there and finding your personal monopoly. Michael, I'm interested what the biggest benefit of Rite of Passage was for you.
Oh man, there's so many actually. So the biggest one probably is giving me permission to be myself online. So I don't think it's any one lesson, but the idea of make a newsletter, make a website, leave them up, because in the past I've tried a bunch of blogs and stuff, and they've all failed within like 5 or 6 posts of whatever kind. And this one felt different. Like, this is your online home. This is your name. This is things that can just stay there long term, and you're committing to over the long term. And I think that put me on a process of self-discovery, of just like, okay, I can be a writer. I can put stuff out there consistently. That made me think, actually, I can be this way. I can do this. Whereas in the past, I didn't. Like, no one read my stuff, right? And no one came across me on the internet. I think in the combination of having the writing process and Twitter and whatever the emerging creator scene is on the internet, all of those came together, and Rite of Passage helped me tap into all of that world, I think.
Do you think you'd be where you are right now? And what I mean by that is working on your own, selling a course if it hadn't been for Rite of Passage?
Almost certainly not, honestly. So actually, the reason that the Alexander Technique thing came along was almost an accident. And what I mean by that is I have a main newsletter. which is kind of personal. That's much smaller in terms of mailing list size than the Alexander Technique one. And I found myself thinking, oh, there's this part, what can I write about? Like, what are the different parts of me that I can just start writing about? And one of them was Alexander Technique. So I had a few weeks where I just did like little articles about it. And I found myself writing more and more about this. And I didn't want to annoy my main newsletter subscribers with this one very, very niche thing.
Yeah.
So I thought I'd spin it out, basically. I'll give it its own brand, its own container, and anyone who wants to go over there can go over there. But I would never have wandered into the people are interested in Alexander Technique and I'm interested in writing about it intersection if I hadn't gone through 15, 20 personal newsletters first and just become comfortable doing that. And the Rite of Passage gave me permission to do that.
Okay. So you're an alumni mentor for Rite of Passage now, right?
Mm-hmm. I was for cohort 6, yes. I guess I might be again for cohort 7.
Okay. What does that role look like?
So the main thing that you're doing as a mentor is running a weekly writing session. So I think there are about 13 mentors in cohort 6, and each one runs a weekly session. People choose to come along based on the mentor profile, and let's be honest, time zones. And it's the mentor's job to design an experience in that hour-long session where people get to know each other. They can practice their writing skills. They can kind of discuss the themes of that week's live session, that kind of thing. So that's one thing. And the other one is just generally kind of contributing to the vibe of the cohort. So giving feedback on writing, hanging out in the forum, answering questions, that kind of thing. So it's a very, very enjoyable process, honestly. And I discovered an unexpected joy in facilitating Zoom sessions, which I did not think I would have, but it's just good fun.
What was your favorite part of being a mentor?
So I really enjoyed in the writing sessions, mentor sessions, seeing people get ideas. When there would be an aha moment, you could see it in the chats, like, oh, I just got something, or they'd ask a question that showed they got it, or something they've been grappling with just kind of cleared up for them. And I just love that moment of like, oh, now I see something I didn't see before. And it has just kept happening. And that's, I think, credit to David's structure of Rite of Passage is that it's designed to spark these aha moments. But having the mentors there to kind of poke in the right times, I was like, hey, have you seen this thing over here? I just really enjoyed that experience.
It sounds like a lot of fun.
It really was.
I guess when I took Rite of Passage, and I think when you took it as well, there were no mentors involved, right?
No, so I did cohort 2 back in 2019, and there were no mentors. And yeah, it was much more basic at the time. It's grown a lot since then, for sure.
Yeah, I was in cohort 3. There were no mentors in that either. But man, it was so beneficial even without the mentors. I can't imagine how awesome it is now.
It's just a lot of fun, and I see people in the community now, in the student base, who are just honestly very impressive people. And I think actually if I'd been a student in this cohort, I'd have been kind of a bit anxious around that. Because like when I was in cohort 2, I was like, I didn't really have much confidence in myself. And now seeing the caliber of people taking the courses and the quality of the interactions they have with each other, like friends are being made and that kind of thing. It's really interesting to see that as the future of, or an example of the future of online education, and how cohort-based learning can be done outside of the traditional academic framework.
Yeah, David certainly set a good example for anybody who wants to kind of move in that direction. All right, next up, a topic that kind of contradicts David's advice, and honestly, the advice of most online creators, and that is avoiding a niche. And you have some really interesting ideas in this area. Can you explain how you think about a niche, you kind of using your analogy of architect versus archaeologist?
Yeah, so let me just give the context for that analogy as well. So when I started writing after Rite of Passage, I tried to figure out what my niche was, basically, and what David calls a personal monopoly, that unique intersection of your interests, personality traits, and skills. And I looked at my background thinking like, okay, well, Alexander Technique, energy system innovation. I live in London, I guess. That could be a thing that I need. And how can I smash these things together to form my unique anodyne? No. This is not working. And what I realized was I had this implicit belief that I had to know what I was niching about, what I was talking about, before I could make anything. And because I didn't have a niche or a personal monopoly, I couldn't make anything. So what I did was just realize that I could discover what I was writing about, who I was even, just by making stuff and seeing what emerged. And that's where the architects and archaeologists came from. So an archaeologist is someone who digs up a city beneath their feet and discovers what's there, kind of brushstroke by brushstroke. They're not constrained by a preconceived idea, whereas an architect is someone who designs first and then builds. And I was approaching my writing like an architect, when switching to archaeologist mode helped unlock my writing. That doesn't mean that I'm against the idea of niches. In fact, as I'm progressing in my journey, I'm appreciating niches more and more. But I think if people are stuck with their niche and not writing because they haven't got one, I think the idea of the niche can be very problematic because it can get in the way of just writing and just putting stuff out there in the world.
Yeah, I totally agree with that. That was one of the things I struggled with in Rite of Passage, was like, yeah, I don't really know what I want to write about. Like, I'm kind of interested in self-improvement, but who isn't, right? And like, can't differentiate myself in that way. But I think I did kind of what you recommend, which was just like create, and see, like an archaeologist, kind of dust it off afterwards and see what appears. I still haven't really found a niche. I'm probably a little closer than I was a year and a half ago, but I'm not there yet.
I'm just curious. I was going to ask, what's your journey been like? Because I saw that some of your early podcast episodes were entirely based around the compulsory national service side of things, and now you branched out. But how did you find that transition from this is my topic for a while into like, oh, now I'm much broader?
Yeah, so the podcast actually started because of the Rite of Passage Fellowship. So the fellowship, I'm not sure how familiar you are with it. I think David only did it once, but there was a group of like 8 or 10 of us who picked one topic we wanted to write a super long essay about. Mine ended up being like 10,000 words, and mine was on compulsory national service, which is something I was super interested in. And in order to research for that essay, part of what I did was interview people who had experience with some type of service to kind of just gain perspective around the idea. So I was like, oh, if I'm going to have these conversations, why not start a podcast, right? So I did, I don't know, 10 or 12 episodes probably with people specifically on the topic of service. And then I published the essay and I was like, yeah, I definitely don't want to be the compulsory national service guy.
Right.
Like, this is something I'm interested in, but it's not going to be the rest of my life. So but I was finding I was enjoying having these conversations. So I said, let me just continue the podcast here. And so it's it's kind of gone the opposite direction, right? Like I started with a niche and it's kind of just branched out to more broad from there.
But that's cool, right? Because you had something that you could make a start with. It's like, okay, I have my first steps, but then you didn't constrain yourself by like, oh, well, I guess now I'm the compulsory national service guy. Oh, well, better keep going down this one. Like you were able to step out of that frame and go in other directions, which I think is really cool, but I think is hard to do on your own in many cases. You can easily get stuck, I think.
Yeah, you know what's interesting is I hadn't actually thought about it or talked about it like this until you asked me that question. But yeah, that's exactly how it happened. So I understand you advocate being prolific to find your niche, but I think some people might not know where to start if they don't have like a specific topic to write about. Can you talk about how you've put this principle into practice, the being prolific to find what you're writing about?
Yeah, absolutely. So for me, it started again with the Rite of Passage by having that newsletter frame of like, okay, every Sunday I have to write something. I always struggled with the here are 5 things I read this week type newsletter, and no shade against those, but they're just not my interest. So I started looking for things in my life that I could talk about. So, oh, this thing happened this week. But then I didn't want to be like, well, here are some photos from my holiday guy. So, okay, I kind of landed on, here are some things I observed this week, and here are some generalizable lessons that I can draw from that to kind of contain this in a way that's useful for my readers. So it's a combination of, my life and interesting stuff that you might find cool. And that basically had me scanning my life for content, and anything became fair game. So just by having that newsletter at first, I just wrote about whatever seemed salient to me at the time. And at the same time, I was getting more and more active on Twitter. So I really see Twitter as a very valuable being prolific tool. I think I now have about 23,000 tweets or something, which is absolute nonsense. It's a very large number. And back when I first started, I was like, let me sit down and think of a tweet worth tweeting. I would get completely stuck trying to think of some kind of witty or clever thing. And now I'm just kind of whatever pops into my head, I just tweet out there. And there's something about going through that process of unlocking enter brain, leave phone versus like sit down, craft something that just unlocks a pipeline of creative output. I find it's just that the practice of getting stuff out. And now I apply it all over the place. So I've got, YouTube channel, I've got a notebook section on my website, which is not essays, but just where I can put writing. And I try to not do, and this is where I think I need to learn from people like you, because you do 10,000 word essays really, really well. I don't. I do 300 or 400 word things really well, and just more of them. I'd like to get better at the long form stuff, but just having a place to put short stuff and getting out there is so helpful.
Yeah. I mean, so many people who are prolific and have grown huge followings or whatever talk about this need for iteration, whether that's through tweets or through like the notebook section on your website, or like Dickie Bush talks about this with his Ship 30 for 30. He was writing these longer form essays and posting them on his website, and he was met with crickets, right? Like nobody said anything about it. And it's not because they weren't good ideas. He just wasn't putting enough of them out there to get the feedback. So he starts posting these atomic essays on Twitter every day. And all of a sudden, he's got 26,000 followers now because he's just putting out content and ideas every single day. And, probably more than half of those don't resonate with people, or people don't resonate with the ideas, and nothing happens. But because you're doing it so frequently, you do have ones that hit. And then when you have those ideas that people like, you can say, okay, let me build on this. Let me do more of this.
You've hit on a really crucial point there, in that the feedback system is so valuable for motivation as well. So you put stuff out there, and if some things will resonate, and like, oh look, I got some hearts, I got some replies, I got more subscribers, great, and that like it pushes you forwards. But going even more deeply, like I was saying earlier about how the design technique profession probably doesn't think the what I'm doing is that possible, and that's because it's normally done in person, through touch, and all that kind of, it's very like body based work normally. And if I had believed, okay, I'm going to revolutionize the industry and I'm going to sit alone in my room and think about ways that I can teach this online without actually doing it, I would have absolutely failed. And it's almost because I was just putting stuff out there almost in, like I said, a shitposty way, and people were liking it. It's like, oh, okay, let me keep iterating on what they're saying, listen to their feedback, talking to them, whatever. That's how I got to what in my view is now quite a simple course structure, but is not like anything else that exists in this field. And I could not have done it without working in public, because that feedback is crucial, both for my motivation and for the actual knowing which direction to go in that works.
Did you find at any point that, like you sit down and you really put a lot of thought into a tweet and you put it out there and nobody gives a shit about it, but then another time you just have something pop into your head, you shoot it out there and it gets a ton of engagement and you're like, what the fuck? Why do people respond like this?
There's something really important in there, because it's like I was saying earlier, when you're stuck in your head thinking, like, I'm going to sit down and think about an important tweet, there's part of you that's doing it is the part that thinks, right? It's the surface layer cognition of like, I'm going to be important now. Whereas when something just occurs to you of like, oh, hey, this just bubbled up, and you just, quickly type it off and it goes, that probably isn't nothing, right? That is the visible manifestation to you of a much more deep process of embodied learning and cognition and experience that's now just ready to be released, right? You're not trying for it, but that doesn't mean it's any less worthwhile. That's why I think those things resonate a lot more with people, because effortlessness is a good thing. It's not, lack of trying is a good thing in this context. Right. Trying harder and looking like you're trying harder is something else, put it that way.
Yeah, I think that's why doing something like stepping out for a walk sometimes just releases these flows of ideas, and then you can come back and sit down and like write something really fantastic because you weren't trying to write something.
Exactly. And then where does that content come from, right? You weren't trying for it. It just appeared. I haven't got the answer to this, but there's an interesting metaphysical question there of like, where do these actually good ideas come from when I'm not trying for them? Let me kind of be with that for a while, because there's something important there, I think.
Yeah, I don't have the answer either, but I think at least partially it comes from everything that you've consumed and all the experiences that you've had, and then time that separates those experiences and that consumption from where you are now. And that time just allows it to kind of sink into your body and let your brain process it subconsciously, and then spit something out that's like, oh, yeah, this is actually useful.
Yeah, I use the analogy of a supercomputer. So there is a supercomputer inside of us that knows how to do most things really well. Like catching a ball is something that you can do effortlessly. You can just like, I intend to catch the ball, and your hand will go there, and it's like, oh, that was easy. But what you don't do is like, well, that ball's going at 10 meters per second. The angle is this. The air resistance is this. That your thinking brain can't do that.
Mm,
But you can interfere with your supercomputer by trying to do that, if you like. So you can get out of the way and just let your body catch the ball,
mm.
and trust that there's something much more capable than you might be. There's not to say that you shouldn't think or that thinking is bad. It's just that thinking is one of many tools and needs to be used appropriately in relationship with this thing rather than as the only thing.
Right, right. Yeah, that's a really important idea to internalize. All right, Michael, I like to give my guests the opportunity to ask me questions. So is there anything that comes to mind?
I guess I'm really curious to hear about your experience with the fellowship, the Rite of Passage Fellowship. Like, what was it like? How did you go through it? What was, the feedback? Just generally talk about what that experience was like for you.
Yeah, so it was an interesting experience because some of the people that were in the fellowship with me, I think I had the same feeling as you did in Rite of Passage, where it's like, wow, these people are really pretty impressive, and what am I doing here? But when you start having conversations, you realize like, oh, they're just people, and maybe they've accomplished more than I have, but my ideas are good, and they like my ideas, and they can give me feedback. So the format, I don't remember if it was 2 meetings a week or 1 meeting a week, but we would basically get together, and David would start with a little bit of a lecture like, hey, this is what you should be doing at this point in the journey. And then we would talk. I think we had breakout rooms where we would kind of just talk about the ideas that we were working through. But a lot of it was self-directed. So I would go away and I would say, like, this is my big idea. Compulsory national service is good. And I think that we should have it. But let me then break that out into like 5 subsections. And then let me take those subsections and break them out further so that when I sit down to work, I'm working on a subsection of a subsection. I'm not trying to write a 10,000 word essay. I'm trying to write a 500 word article that I can then string together with 10 other 500 word articles and have half of my essay done.
Cool.
So David really kind of talked us through that in a way that takes this daunting task of a 10,000 word essay and makes it a super manageable thing. So I would start with something like, what are the national service programs that are out there right now? Right. And I would find like 5 programs, and then I would dive in deep into one of those programs and say, like, oh, what does this look like? What has somebody's experience been who has done this program? And then I could kind of condense that into just a little section. And then you
Mm.
just start assembling the pieces of the puzzle. And so another super valuable part of the fellowship was that we had professional editors to work with. And I had never done that before, but holy cow, that really just unlocks your brain and makes your writing so much better. Like, if you read my compulsory national service essay and you put that alongside pretty much anything else on my website, you're going to be like, 2 different people wrote these pieces. And that's because I had an editor reading through every line and saying, like, this doesn't make sense here. You got to move it around to there. Or I'm not really sure what you're trying to say here. Maybe you want to look at it from this angle. So, all that to say, having an editor is very valuable. Having other intelligent people who can kind of speak to your ideas is very valuable. And then breaking huge tasks down into little bite-sized pieces is really valuable, and being able to publish something that is long and meaningful and coherent.
Mm. Nice. That's fantastic. And I'm about 2/3 of the way through that article. I didn't realize quite how long it was. I timed out, but it's so good.
Thank you.
It flows really, really well, and all the points are just beautifully made. I do have one follow-up question. If that's okay, though.
Yeah, of course.
I was watching David's interview with Morgan Housel in the Rite of Passage archives, and he says that he doesn't use an editor. He doesn't write an editor. Sorry, he doesn't have collaborators. He just writes on his own. And you mentioned there that the piece that you wrote there was very different from the others because you had an editor. So how do you feel about the way that your voice and style changes with an editor compared to when you haven't got an editor? Like, which one is your voice? How do you think about the authenticity of that writing? in that context?
Yeah, I've actually thought about this a lot, and I don't think that an editor really changes your voice. I think that the editor improves the experience for the reader. So Tom White was my editor, and I want to give him props because he's fantastic. He works for On Deck now, and everybody should go follow him on Twitter. He's great. But what he did for me basically was accept my pushback. So if he made a suggestion and I was like, no, that's not really how I want to say it, he'd be like, okay, totally fine. But he would put all those ideas out there for me in a way that was like, hey, this might not make sense to a reader. So he's not really changing your voice, but he's improving the experience for the end user. But there's another part of this too. So like Morgan doesn't use an editor. His writing, I think, is some of the best writing on the internet. He's somebody who, I want to emulate. His writing's fantastic. He's been writing for 15 years, maybe.
Right.
He
Fair
started
enough.
writing for the Motley Fool, and he was writing like 3 articles a day or something insane like that, right? So he's written probably tens of thousands of articles. So even if he's never had an editor, like his stuff at the beginning was probably not very good compared to what it is now. So I think when you have enough experience, maybe you don't need an editor as much. And I still question the value of even peer editing, like going through On Deck and going through I belong to another group online. I don't even remember what it was called, but I would submit my pieces to that and get peer feedback. And sometimes I would feel like this is actually almost counterproductive because like I know what I want to say. And now I have 7 people saying, well, have you thought about this? Have you thought about that?
Yeah.
And it's like, no, or yes, I have thought about that. And that's not what I want to say. I just want to publish this piece. I don't need everybody shouting their information at me. So I'm not sure if I put that in a coherent package for you, but yeah, that's kind of how I think about editors.
No, it's useful, I guess. It's pointing to the fact that different kinds of feedback serve different purposes. So the peer feedback I see being useful in getting a broad church of perspectives, like, do you understand this? Whereas a professional editor is like, well, actually, I'm going to make you sound better rather than minimize my confusion, which is possibly what peer feedback does.
Yeah.
So yeah, it's interesting. And I had not like made the link that, of course, Morgan has got like decades of very high flying writing experience that I don't have. So of course, that's why I might not need an editor.
Yeah. Yeah. Thanks for summarizing that in a concise and coherent way. Cause I rambled on and then you're like, yeah, 1, 2, 3. That's what you said.
Ex-consultant. It's easier when you're talking to someone else to summarize their work than your own, I think.
Yeah. Yeah, for sure. All right. I'd like to finish our conversation by asking you some rapid fire questions.
Sure.
First up, what advice would you give to a smart driven college student about to graduate?
I would say try lots of things. It's easy to be directed into a particular pathway that you happen to be on, or that path dependency put you on to be where you are now, but be open to doing other things and try doing lots of things until you find something that might fit better.
Fantastic advice. What is a favorite mental model you use in your life?
So I'm going to go back to Alexander technique, but when something is going wrong or not working properly, it's very common to ask yourself, oh, what can I do differently to fix this? Where the mental model I prefer is, what might I be doing that I can stop doing that will cause this thing to resolve itself?
Man, I need to think on that. That's a good one. Who is your favorite Twitter follow?
Visa in Singapore, without a doubt, because he is he is demonstrating how I want to be on Twitter. He's creating a culture and a vibe of this friendly space that I think encourages earnestness. And by watching how he tweets, I learn how to be a better Twitter citizen, I think.
Very cool. All right, last one. This is one that I borrow from Patrick O'Shaughnessy. What is the kindest thing anyone has ever done for you?
So what's coming to my mind, actually, unexpectedly, is when I was at university, I was doing a 3-year physics degree, and then a 4-year degree, sorry, and I decided to switch on to a 1-year master's instead, so changed down to a 3-year. And my mum at the time, she said that she very nearly challenged me or said, is this a good idea, and that kind of thing. But instead, she just said, you seem to know what you're doing. good luck. And I think that was a very kind thing to do, rather than getting my head in loops, just saying, oh no, you seem to know what you're doing. Have fun. That was just a lovely moment for me.
Wow, that's awesome. I love that. Michael, this has been a great conversation. I really appreciate you coming on. Where can people find you if they want to continue the conversation, read your writing, sign up for your course, all that stuff?
Sure, and thank you for having me. It's been a really fun experience. So people can find me at michaelashcroft.org. The AC newsletter is expandingawareness.org, and there's a full website coming. And I'm on Twitter at m_Ashcroft.
Awesome. I will link to all that in the show notes. And again, thank you for coming on. This was a lot of fun.
Thank you.